Hey guys, this is TechAudi. I welcome you to another video tutorial where we are building this CMS application using Angular 10 and ASP.NET Core 3. In the last video tutorial, we finished creating the data service and the the functional service. Now in this video tutorial, we will be consuming these two services in the main project. We will be creating our migrations, basically going and creating our database using EntityFrameworkCore. So if you haven't watched the last two video tutorials, this is the part 3 of creating database video tutorial. In the part 1 we created the data service. In the part 2 we created the functional service, where we have implemented methods to create the default admin user and the default app user. So if you have not watched that video, you would need to watch it in order to follow along in this part 3. So in this video tutorial, we are going to consume our data service and create migrations. So before doing that, it's very important that you have watched the setup video or you already have MS SQL installed on your machine. So I have a Mac OS system, therefore I have installed MS SQL on Docker container, and I have created a video. That's the setup video tutorial in this video tutorial playlist. You can find it. It should be the second video after the demo video, where I've shown how to install MS SQL Server on Mac using Docker container. Once you have installed MS SQL Server on your Docker container, the next thing is to make sure your Docker container is up and running, and you can do that by going to this Docker icon and checking if Docker desktop is running. If it's not, go ahead and start Docker. To start Docker, if you don't see the icon here, go to your Launchpad and search for Docker, and this should be the icon for Docker. Click on it and start it. We will also need Kitematic to make sure that we start the MS SQL container that we have installed. So we'll go ahead, click on the container and start the container. The container will not start unless Docker is up and running. So make sure that Docker is running before you start the container. Now the next thing that we also want to do is go ahead and start our Azure Data Studio. We can use this. It's a GUI application. It's like a client that we will use to connect or communicate with our database. Once the database is installed, we will log in and we will check if the database is created. Now let's go ahead back to the project, and now in our main project, go ahead, right click on the dependency folder, add references. We'll go ahead and add reference to the data service. Let's click OK. And the project is saved. So now we can use the classes inside the data service folder or data service project in our main project. Open up your startup.cs file, and here in the startup.cs file, we need to add the service in the middleware. We need to inject the service in the middleware of this application. So when the application runs, we can inject these services wherever in the application they are required. To inject these services, to inject the data service, we have to make sure that it's up and running and it's in our middleware. And to add that, we are going to add this service in the configure services method. So here we'll be setting up the database connection. We will be adding the application DB context to the middleware of our application, or to the pipeline of our application. And before we do the connection, we need to make sure that the connection string is added in our app-settings.json file. If you have not yet created your database with MS SQL, as I mentioned, watch the setup video tutorial. Here for the connection string, all you need to do is go ahead and create a connection string property over here called as connection strings, and then you need to just add your connection string. So I named my connection string as CMS core ng_dev. That's the name of my project, and this connection string is for my development server. So the connection string is the name of your server, which is localhost. So if I go back to Azure Data Studio, I can disconnect from this server and I can show you. So my server name is localhost, my username is SA, and my password is docker SQL123. So I can connect. Okay, sorry, it's docker S capital QL123. So yes, this should work. So that's my password. So that's what I have used over here. So I just need to change this. Docker SQL123, and I have, when I create the database, I have named it as CMS Core NG. So you could name it whatever you like. If you are having separate environments like me, where I like to keep my development server separate and my production server separate, so I will create usually I will create two strings inside the connection string, one for dev and one for prod. So up to you guys. So if you want, you can use these naming conventions, or you can just have one connection string. For this project we are just working on development, so let's focus on this connection string here. For Windows users, if you are working on Docker, then you can use this connection string. But if you're not, you're working directly on MS SQL server installed on your machine, your connection string would be slightly different compared to the ones on Mac OS or the server installed on Docker container. That's because you might have Windows authentication enabled instead of server administrator password logging. So you could find your connection string, how to create a connection string or find your connection string on this website. I'll just give you a reference. So the website is called connectionstrings.com. Here, when you go to this website, all you could do is search for SQL server /SQL server, and here there are some bunch of connection strings that you can use. So try one of them, replace these with your credentials like your username, your server name, and then try one of these should work. And then once it works, then you're all set to create the database. So now we have added the connection string, and next thing that we want to do is go back to our startup class, and here we need to add the DB context. Our DB context is the application DB context. We have the data protection keys context. So we have two contexts that we are using, two databases, and we need to add them here. Okay, so to add them, first thing we need to do is we need to add certain NuGet packages. And as of ASP.NET Core 3, if you look at the dependencies folder and you go to NuGet packages, you would not see a bunch of packages come shipped along with ASP.NET Core. We need to install them now, because it's, if you need it, you will install it. It doesn't come pre-installed with ASP.NET Core. So now we need to install certain packages, as I mentioned. So let's go ahead and install them. Just right click, go to manage NuGet packages, and now here we will search for the package Microsoft and .EntityFrameworkCore design. So I will add the names of all the packages in the video description, so it will be easy for you to find them. So let's search for Microsoft.EntityFrameworkCore.design. Add this package, choose the latest stable version and add it. So accept any conditions, terms and conditions, because you need to add some additional packages and you need to accept the terms and conditions before you add them. And here we have added the Entity Framework Core design package. The next package that we want to add is EntityFrameworkCore.SQL server. So let's go ahead and add it. So let's right click, manage NuGet packages, search for Microsoft.EntityFrameworkCore.SQL server. Let's select that stable version and add the package. Now the next package that we will also need to add, accept this, would be Microsoft.Extensions.Dependency Injection, because the packages that we will be adding to our pipeline, we need to inject them in the controllers or in our application. So we need to make sure we have the dependency injection package installed. So just go ahead, manage NuGet packages, search for Microsoft extensions.dependency injections. So here's the package. So let's select this and then let's add the stable version. I'll leave the names of these packages in the video description, so you should be easy to find it. Now the packages have been installed, so we can now go ahead and add these services that are needed to connect to our database. So let's add services dot add db context. Let's name the DB context that we want to add. So we want to add application DB context. That's the name of the context class that we have created in data service, which is application DB context and data protection keys context. So application context, let's add the reference using data service. And then what we need to do is we need to add the connection string, and we need to also make sure that we name the assembly. So to add the connection string, we are going to specify certain options. Here inside the options, you're going to use options dot use SQL server, because we have MS SQL Server installed. That's our main database using Microsoft Entity Framework Core. Let's add the import statement. And also here now we need to specify certain configuration settings. So we need to specify the connection string. So we created the connection string in app settings.json file. The name of the connection string is CMS core ng underscore dev. Let's copy this, go back here, and inside here we need to use the configuration object dot. There is a method which we can use, which is get connection string, and when we use this method it will get the connection string from your app settings file. All you need to do is specify the name of the connection string which we just copied, which is CMS core ng underscore dev. Now that's done. Now the second parameter here is to specify which assembly does this application DB context reside, or where does it need to create the application, where can it find the application DB context. Since we have created in a separate project, which is a class library, we need to add this option over here, which would be x dot. So I am using some lambda expression, and I'm going to use the method which is migration assembly. So the migration assembly, and the name of our migration assembly is the name of the project. So whatever you have named your main project, I have named my project CMS underscore core underscore ng, so that becomes my migration assembly. If you have named this project something else, use that. So CMS underscore core underscore ng. So that's all we need to do. In the migration assembly, it will find the library for data service, and inside that it's going to find the application DB context. So the DLL for that project will be found inside the migration assembly. So now the next thing that we need to do is add our data protection key context, which is our second database that we are creating to store all the keys, or the encrypted keys of our application. So for that reason we need to have a separate database. So let's go ahead and create that. So services dot add DB context. Name of the DB context is data protection keys context, and we need to get the connection string. But please note that we have not added the connection string over here, which I forgot. So let's go ahead and add that connection string. So I want to call this CMS underscore, so I can just call this data protection keys context. I don't need to create a dev or prod version of this. If you need to, you can create that, but I'm just going to use this version, which is data protection keys context. So I am going to name this database as data protection keys context as well. The username and the password remains the same. So I'm going to use this. Go back to the startup class. Here I'm going to say configuration dot get connection string, specify the name of the connection string which I just added, which was oh, I'm sorry, I need to add the options. And options dot use SQL server, and then I need to add this connection string. So let's put it on the new line, and now I need to specify the migration assembly. Once again, the migration assembly is going to be our main project, so let's to copy paste it from here. So that should be it for this connection string. We have successfully now assigned the connection string and added it to the pipeline. So whenever in our application we need to access any data, we can use dependency injection and then access an instance of the application DB context and get our data. We will do that in the upcoming videos, but now just pay attention on how to create the connection string if you have your data service in a class library. So we have done that. Now the next step would be to, when this application runs, we call this method, which is the initialize method that we have created in the DB context initializer, to initialize our database, where the method will ensure that the databases are created and the application users, that's the admin user and the default user, both of them are created. So to call this method, we are going to go to the program class of our application. So the program class of our application, inside the program class, let's delete this additional log errors that I'm printing for test. Inside your using statement, where you have created the scope. So we had created the scope while we were testing the logs, when we created the Serilog logging logger. We implemented the Serilog logging in our application. So we will use the same scope. Inside the scope, what we need to do is we'll create a variable called as services, and we will get all the services from our applications pipeline. So to do that, all we have to do is use this scope object, and using the scope object we will call the service provider. Now we can access all the services through the service provider. Now the next step that we want to do is create a try catch block. So inside the catch block, while our application loads, if we have any kind of errors, we will log them using Serilog. So all we have to do is call the Serilog's log method dot error and print the error. Now here what we want to do is we need to create a context. So services dot get required service, and the required service is application DB context. Let's add the missing reference. Let's also get the data protection context, which is DP, and which will be data protection key context. Next thing that we need is the functional service. Functional SVC is services. Just copy this. Functional SVC. So let's add the missing reference. One more thing, note that in this project, when we added the reference, we have not added the reference to functional service, but we still can access functional service. That is because we added reference to the project data service, and data service already has a reference for functional service. So through data service we can now access functional service, so we don't need to add a reference separately for functional service. So I can just access functional service. Now why did I create these three objects? That's because in our database context initialize method, we need to pass these three objects as parameters: data protection context, application DB context, and functional service. Now let's go back to the program class. Next thing that we want to do is we need to call the static method, which is the db context initializer. So db context initializer dot initialize method to initialize the database. First we need to pass the data protection key context, so let's pass that. Second thing we need to pass is the application db context, so let's pass that. And finally we need to pass the functional service. Now we're getting this squiggly line because this is an asynchronous operation, so we need to add a wait over here. Now since our program class is not an async method, or our main method is not an asynchronous method, in order to use the await operator your method needs to be asynchronous. So what we can do instead is we can just do dot wait, and this will do the trick for us. Next thing that we want to do is we missed adding the functional service, so let's go ahead and add it to the pipeline. Otherwise when we run this application, the application will try to get this service from the startup class, and we have not yet added it to the pipeline, so therefore it will throw an error. So let's go ahead and add this functional service. Okay, so let's add it over here, the functional service. I have added a transient version of the functional service, so for every time, for every request, a new object will be instantiated. So we have add transient, we have add scope, and we will get into that documentation, or I will explain it to you as we proceed. But for now, just understand, when we add a service as add transient, it means that for every request we'll have a new object instantiated. So for this missing references, let's add them to our startup class using functional service. Now a last thing that we would also want to do is in the db context initializer method. So if we go back here, and we are calling the functional service, and we are calling, if we go to the functional service here, if you notice, we are passing, we are injecting certain options. One of them is the app user options, and then we have the admin user options. So where is it going to get these options? Because we are injecting these options as dependency injection in the constructor of this class. So these options are not provided in the startup class. So once again it will throw an error because it cannot instantiate those objects because the service is not available. So we also need to add these two classes that we created, admin user option and app user options, in the services. So let's go ahead and add them. So here just below the add transient method, I'm going to add these services.configure admin user options and services.configure app user options. Let's add the missing reference using model service. Now notice that we have said we are going to get these options from the app settings, which is configuration file, but we have not yet created them. So let's go ahead and create this in the app settings file so it can go and get these values. So here just below the logging service, I'm going to add it. So I've added the admin user option and the app user options. Make sure whatever name or the property name you provide here, the key name, it matches the name that you provide in your startup class over here. So add these options, and here I have added the default values for the users when the users are created, like the email would be so and so, the password will be test at 123. So when the users are created, they will be created using these values. Don't worry about the profile pic because we have not yet implemented that, and in the upcoming videos I will show you how to add pictures or images in your project and how to use them. So for now you can add any connection string, you can leave it empty as well. So this should be it for this admin user and app user option. So the next thing that we want to do now, after we have added this admin user options and app user options, we need to go back to the functional service, and here if you see we have one more object that we are passing into the parameters of functional service, which is the user manager object, and we are passing the application user. Now, if you hover over user manager, you will see that it's a part of Microsoft ASP.NET Core identity. So we have to set up that in the pipeline of our application in the startup class in order so that when the constructor tries to inject this service, it is available as well. So now what we want to do is go ahead and add our identity options. So let's go ahead and add it over here just below the functional service. So here we will add it. Just before we add it, we would need to create a identity default option class that we can use to map over properties from app settings to these to the object class. So we have already created the class for admin user option and app user options, but for the identity default options we don't have a model as of yet created. So let's go ahead and add that model. So let's add a new class, call this identity default options, and I will hit new. So the identity default options class is created. We don't need the constructor. And here we will add the properties that we need to map over. So I have created 3 sections here. I put the comment for you guys to understand. So we'll have the password properties, we'll have the lockout properties, and we'll have the user properties. So for the password properties, we will set how we want the passwords to be set up in our application when the user signs up, how they should create passwords, like how many digits are required, how many alphabets are required, lowercase, uppercase. If you feel you need something more than what I have said, you can add them, but this is what I'm going to set. And this is the lockout properties. So the lockout properties are going to be how many failed attempts. For do we want to set up lockout for all new users? So let's say the new user registers, do you want to set the lockout enable, and the admin needs to go ahead and then makes them unlock their account so that they can use it, because in certain websites they use a system like this where the admin will approve. Until the admin approves, the user cannot use the services of the website, and so on. So we have the user properties where we will say if the user is required to specify a unique email. So if a user specifies a email, that email cannot be used to create any other account. If the sign in required is required for the confirm email, and if the access denied path, if the user is not authorized, which page you want the user to be redirected. So this is the access denied path. So I've added these properties here. Now my next step would be is to create a key in the app settings and map over those properties here as well, so that I can use them in the startup class, similar to how I did with admin user and app user options. So I'm going to go here. So I'm going to add it over here. So I'm going to add these properties over here. So the same properties that I have in my class that I just created for identity default options, I have mapped them over here in app settings. Let's save this and go back to our startup class. In our startup class, under the default identity options, I'm going to start using these identity default options. So I'll create a variable called as identity default options is equal to configuration dot get section, and get section would be the name of the section which I just created. So the name of the section was identity default options. So go back to startup here. So now this object will contain the values of my app settings section for identity default options. Next thing I wanted to do is services dot configure, and what I want to configure is identity default options. And what I am saying here, map these values to this identity default option class. Now the next step that I want to do is create another variable, call it identity default options, and say is equal to identity. Let's call this configuration for better naming convention configuration. And then what I want to do is using this identity default configuration class dot get, I want to get the identity default options. Now I'm going to add another services dot add identity. Because why am I adding identity? Because I need identity options in my class, which is the functional service class here, to get the user manager. So I'm going to go back to my startup class and add the application user and identity role. Let's add the missing reference using Microsoft Identity. And now all these options that we created, we need to pass these options here in the application, in the pipeline. So somebody tries to register in your application, so the request will come to the pipeline and it will validate that the request that comes in, the properties that come in, match the requirement that you have set for the properties for user creation. So let's create the options or specify the options for identity. So options dot password. So let's put this on the second line. Options dot password is dot required digit. So how many digits of password we require? So in my case, in this application, I want the users to have at least 6 digits in their password, or 6 characters in their password. And I want them to have numbers in their password. So digit is required. So if I go back to my startup class, so where am I getting this password required digit value from? I'm getting it from this object, and this object is now mapped over to identity default options. So I'll do identity default options dot password required digit. So that's the first one that I have passed, but I need to pass so many of them. So like I need to create all the properties, and to save time I'll just copy paste them. So I have added the properties here. I need the properties that should be mapped over. So is the password required length, and I'm getting all these properties from app settings. So I'll put this code in the DevOps repo, so you will have access to it. You can double check your values. Here I'm missing the time span reference, so I'll add the import the missing references. And if I want the lockout to be enabled, and how long I want the lockout to be enabled, I have to specify the time span. So in my app settings, I'm getting it from here, and I'm saying lockout for 30 minutes. So you can change it or you can update it. It's up to you. You can remove it if you don't want it, but here for max failed attempts, I will set it to 5. So if you don't provide these values, it will use the default values. So this is the values. I'm saying I put my comments here if the email is required to be unique. I already explained that. So now the last thing that I want to do here is, after the properties have been of the options for the properties have been created, I just need to do add them to the entity. So I'll use add entity framework stores. I'm going to pass the application DB context where I want them to be stored, and I'll use the default add default token providers for now. So don't worry about the tokens because we are going to create JWT token implementation, which I will show you guys how to create the JWT token, how to refresh tokens, and how to implement it in your projects. So for now, all we have used this default schema and just specified our own properties for the registration of the users. Let's go ahead and now build this project to make sure that there are no errors. And once the project is built, we will start creating the migrations. So build is successful. I don't have any errors. Now the next thing I want to do is create migrations. So migrations will be created by EntityFrameworkCore, and we will have an output on a file which basically contains the code to create our database tables or database structure. That will be done by EntityFrameworkCore, so we don't have to write any queries. Now to run that command, first thing we need to do is open our project in terminal. So right click on your project, go to tools and open it in terminal. Now, as I mentioned earlier that ASP.NET Core 3 does not come with any packages shipped, or SDK does not come with any packages shipped. So we need to install a tool before we run some .NET commands in our terminal. So to do that, first thing I would do is .NET tool install -- global .NET -ef entity framework. So we need to add this tool globally in our computer so that we can use the .NET EF command. If you try to run any .NET EF commands, it won't work unless you install this tool. You have to just do it once, and anytime you're creating any projects in your on your computer, then always .NET EF command will work. So let's hit enter. So now you can see it says you can now invoke the tool using the .NET EF command. So now let me clear this. Let's type our command. The first command that we need to create migrations for our application DB context. So let's create it. .NET EF migrations add. Let's name a migration initial create. Let's add -- context, specify the context. Now the name of the context is application DB context. So I'll just expand this so you can see it. So is .NET EF migrations add. I've given my migrations a name. You can name your migrations anything. Since it's my first migration, I called it initial create. You can name it whatever you like. Then you will use the context flag, which is -- context, and name the context for which you want to create the migration. Since I have more than one context, I have to specify the name of the context. So let's hit enter. Now the build is started. It's going to create the migrations. It will create a migrations folder in your project, and then inside that migration folder, it will contain all the code to create your database structure. So as you see, the migrations folder is created. If you open this file, you will see it has the code to create your database tables. You can go through it in detail if you wish to, so we'll not spend time on that. We have another file. It's basically the timestamp and the name of the migration when it was created. So now we have to run the command again, because as I said, we have two contexts. So let's run it again. This time I'm going to run it for data protection keys context. So hit enter. Let me just do it here. Let me hit enter. And now the context the migrations will be created for data protection key context. So as you can see, it's created. Now if you go to the migrations folder, you will see there's another folder created because it's a separate context, and you will have the file created for that. So now what we want to do is we want to go ahead and run this application. So as I told you that we have this application set up in such a way that when the application runs, the database will be created. Usually in Entity Framework Core, we will go ahead and then run the migrations from the terminal window by running the migrations command. But here, what we want to do is we just need to run this application. Since our migration is already created, the initialize method will be called, and then it will ensure that the database is created. To show you that, let's go ahead and check in our database that if we have any databases. No. So let's minimize this, go ahead and run this application. Now when I run this application, the database should be created. For those who are wondering why I'm seeing this info as highlighted in my console, note that we have implemented a custom console theme, and I have created a video for that in the video tutorial. You can watch that video, how to implement it. Now the application is running. So let's go ahead and check the database. Let's refresh this database. Voila. So as you can see that the database is created. We didn't have to run the command. Now let's go ahead and check the tables. ASP.NET Core Identity has created the tables for us. Remember, we extended the ASP.NET application user class. So let's go ahead and check the ASP.NET user table. And here you will see, first of all, that our two default users have been created because the initialize method was executed. And the additional tables that we added, additional columns that we added for in the application user class, that have been also been created and added because we had extended the class. So now let's go ahead and try to do one thing. Let's try to create a new query. Run these two queries. Let's go ahead back to application, stop of application. Now let's go ahead back to the Azure Data Studio and run this query. Now I've run this query, and what happened is that the database has been deleted. I have dropped both these databases. So let's refresh. Now I don't have this database. Now once again, if I run my application, the ensure database created command will get executed and the application database will be created. So I will run this again. So now the database initialize method, context initializer method, will make sure that the database is created and two default users also have been created. So the application is loading. So loaded. Now if I go back to the Azure Data Studio, I refresh the database. Now the database is created and we have all our tables, and we should also have the two default users in our table as well, as you can see. So this, if the users already exist, then the application will not create them again. Instead, it will just return this method and end the further execution. So if we stop this and run this application again, you should see this breakpoint being hit because users already exist. As you can see, the breakpoint is hit. Now if I run this application, then we should not see this database being created again. So application has run. So if I go back to the database, I don't have duplicate users, nor I have any issues with the database. So that's how we create database using the initialize method that I created. Now for this video tutorial, we have finished creating the database and I have implemented the data service, consumed it in the main project. You can watch the part 1, part 2 and part 3 of this video tutorial to understand how we implemented the database in this application. If you have any questions, use the comment section. For all the code that's used in this project will be available in our DevOps repo. You can download it from there. And please like and subscribe our channel. Tech Howdy.